All right, we're all here.
Good.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Andrew Dohrmann. I'm TYLin's Director of Government Relations. Thank you all for joining for what will be a really interesting panel discussion about what's happening in Washington, D.C., a little crystal ball of what may occur later this year, and what it means for transportation agencies of all types around the country. I was really excited to put together this panel of a lot of folks that I used to work with in my prior life when I worked in Washington, D.C., on the Senate Environment Public Works Committee on the last two federal transportation bills. Put together this panel of folks who bring different perspectives from their experience in Washington, D.C., leading different types of agencies, from the state DOT to a city DOT to a rail agency, and what I like to call the best MPO in the country, I think, to talk about how the discussion about infrastructure and transportation reauthorization, what it could mean for their respective agencies and their communities. So we're going to start with opening remarks from Kathy Dedrick, the staff director for Chairman DeFazio on the House Committee on Transportation Infrastructure. The timing of this panel could not be more fortuitous, because tomorrow her committee is will be taking up the Invest in America Act, which is just an incredibly massive and transformational surface transportation reauthorization bill. So I will quickly go through the panel, introduce the panelists, and then Kathy will give some remarks to set the table and discuss what her committee is working on and what the real discussion behind the scenes in Congress is about what may be occurring over the coming months with transportation and infrastructure. So for starters, we have Gia Biagi. She's the commissioner of the Chicago DOT. She has a really, I think, interesting background of public sector and private sector life in Chicago, looking to improve the quality of life, space making, accessibility. And so her role as a commissioner, her work with NACTO brings an important voice to this panel. Joe Giletti. Joe, I like to call Joe Mr. Railroad, but he's currently the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Transportation, where he has a broad jurisdiction over highways, rails, seaports, etc. But he has a lengthy career, and not to age him, but I think his 50-year anniversary of public service is coming up this year. So we thank Joe for his career, really improving safety on the railroads, and he will discuss from his experience running the Metro North Railroad and the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority. He has just incredible experience all around the country with public infrastructure and transportation. Next, Therese McMillan. Therese is the executive director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area, known as MTC. I think many on this call in the audience will know Therese from her time serving under the Obama administration at FTA as a deputy and acting FTA administrator. Prior to that, she had a long career at MTC, so we were fortunate that she came home to MTC in 2019 as the executive director. And in between, she served as the chief planning officer at Los Angeles County Metro Transportation Authority, which is undergoing probably the largest capital program in the country and really re-envisioning transportation in Los Angeles County. So she has a lot of perspectives and experience to share. And last but definitely not least is Peter Rogoff, another leader that I think most people in the audience will know of or have heard of. Peter is the CEO of Sound Transit in Washington State. Prior to taking the helm of Sound Transit in 2016, I think Peter was for those who don't know, a real institution in Washington, D.C. in federal transportation circles for a few decades in the Senate, overseeing all federal surface transportation, aviation funding on the Senate Appropriations Committee. And then, of course, his time in the Obama administration, not only as FTA administrator, but also Undersecretary for Policy. So I want to thank all the panelists and Kathy for being here. We really appreciate your time and sharing your insights on what the discussion in Congress means to your agencies, but also sharing your thoughts about what are they doing right, what are they doing wrong, and what are your agency's priorities to really make any legislative package work for your agencies. So like I mentioned, Kathy, she's the staff director for Chairman DeFazio. She has a long career serving both in the Senate and the Obama administration. She is so highly regarded in Washington, D.C. for transportation, in her role. And I'm proud to have actually worked for Kathy years ago on the Senate committee, and she hired me. So thank you, Kathy, for participating the 24 hours before or less before your committee marks up your legislation. So with no further ado, Kathy, do you want to let us know what's really happening in DC right now?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's a very busy time in Washington, D.C. right now. And as most of you probably know, the Senate recently marked up their surface transportation bill right before Memorial Day recess. It was a bipartisan bill and significant funding. But now it's the House's turn to act. So on Friday, we introduced the Invest in America Act, which is a $547 billion surface transportation program. So it funds highways, roads, and rail. There's $343 billion for roads, bridges, $109 billion for transit, and $95 billion for rail, which is a huge amount of money and matches what's in the American Jobs Plan. Tomorrow, hopefully at this time, we will be in the midst of our markup of that legislation. We're actually marking up two bills tomorrow. So we're starting with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund reauthorization, which is also part of the American Jobs Plan and a big priority for our committee. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to move on to surface transportation. The bill is based off of what we did last year. This very similar legislation, HR 2, was what we took to the floor, and the surface piece of that was called the Invest in America Act. So that's what we're going to be marking up tomorrow. We have increased the funding levels. Last year, we were around $500 billion. Now we're about $50 billion above that. Most of that is to account for the American Jobs Plan and trying to increase investment for things that the president has highlighted. So we had a lot of money and a lot of programs dealing with climate change in last year's bill. I mean, that's really the focus of our legislation is we want to transform the current programs, not just continue to send money out the same way. So we have woven climate and resiliency into everything that FHWA in particular would do. We've got, like $8.3 billion for a carbon pollution reduction program. And this year we've got $4 billion for electric vehicle charging that'll work on the corridors throughout the United States. That's very much in line with what the president is asking for in terms of more investment. And we've got I'm trying to think of what other ones. Significant increases in things like rural transit, a 50% increase, and more for bridges, both rural and on-system bridges. And then on the rail side, this year we have tripled funding for Amtrak, so we'd be providing $32 billion. As well as making other enhancements that we had in last year's bill, things like giving Amtrak right of really getting them the ability to get preference to the track over freight rail. So there's a lot of really good policy stuff in here. We think this bill is very transformative. It's not just putting money into the same programs that we've always funded, but it is actually changing those programs, putting in some performance measures, whether it's for greenhouse gas emissions or safety, and really making sure people have to meet those. And so we're really excited. I think there's a lot of confusion about where we go from here or what this all means. Our plan is to mark up the bill tomorrow, probably into Thursday, hopefully not Friday, and then take it to the floor. I expect we'll be on the floor at some point in June. And, that's what Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Pelosi, had said earlier on. We want to do something before the 4th of July, and we can meet that here in the House. We're hoping the Senate will be able to mark up the other pieces of their bill. So far, they've only done the highway portion, the EPW portion. So we need Senate banking to do a transit title and commerce to do rail and motor carriers in NHTSA. So we're waiting on, we're not waiting on that. We're just hoping they do it soon so that we can then conference with the Senate as soon as we can get our bill across the floor, like I said, which we hope happens in June. There's a lot of other talk, of course, about the American Jobs Plan, and we really see our bill as a cornerstone of that. It starts the conversation. It's the policy in our bill is really important to us. And if at the end of the day you end up moving an American Jobs Plan through a reconciliation process, a lot of the policy that we have wouldn't really work. It wouldn't pass the Senate rules on the Byrd test. So we think we have to do a surface bill, and we also probably need to provide, well, not probably, probably. We do need to provide additional investment, even more than what we're providing in this package. So we see this as a two-step process, moving to reauthorization and then a larger infrastructure package that can include things beyond even surface transportation. I mean, broadband, which was in HR2 last year. There's a lot of other things that we really do need to do. They're not in this bill. But we have a deadline of September 30th to reauthorize the programs, and that's what we're going to try and do. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
You're muted, Andrew.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Kathy. That gives us a lot to discuss and chew on, and maybe debate even, just depending on how the conversation goes. So thank you again for joining us and giving us the inside scoop, and good luck tomorrow with the markup and going forward.
Thank you, and I'm back to look at amendments now.
All right. Well, so now we're going to move into the panel discussion, and I want to note for the audience that this whole event is being recorded and will be made available later to all attendees. And in the chat window, folks have already said hello and things like that. If you want to suggest a question, feel free to type that into the chat box. And if there's time, we'll see what we can get to later in the conversation. But first, I want to get the ball rolling with the conversation between the panelists. So, as Kathy laid out, there's a lot of good things happening in the committees, and there's a lot of high-level public negotiating between the administration and Senate Republicans. It's unclear if that will lead to anything, and then what is the fallback plan. But you have all these moving pieces. You have the American Jobs Plan. We have the surface transportation reauthorization, which expires later this year. But actually, since the Highway Trust Fund is solvent for another year, what impact does that have on the urgency to move a reauthorization bill this year? And then you have the House and Senate with really different, I think, scopes of legislation and how the scale and how much reform goes into a surface transportation reauthorization bill. So the big question, where does all this lead? So for starters, one question for all the participants, just to learn a little bit more about what you're advocating for in this window of opportunity. What are your agency's top 1 or 2 priorities for any federal infrastructure package or transportation reauthorization bill? And if you feel so brave, what's one thing that you actually don't want to see happen? Maybe a mistake that you felt has been made previously, or something you see maybe a missed opportunity. So, G, I'll put you on the spot. What are Chicago's priorities, and what are you hoping to see and not see?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. I think what we don't want to see is no action. So I mean, maybe that's the most obvious answer. But we certainly would like to see things happen. If they can happen in a bipartisan way, that's great. But hopefully not to diminish the amount of overall funding. Because I think from Chicago's perspective, we have a lot of needs. And I think every major city in the country would say the same, particularly around our transit system, the Chicago Transit Authority, which I do not manage. I manage the tabletop, essentially, that the trains and buses run on. But we are hand in glove, right? Our infrastructure, our ability to improve stations, that's what we do in partnership. But we've got regionally about a $20 billion backlog in terms of a need for transit infrastructure just in the Chicago region. And we're a place, I like all roads and trains and lead to Chicago, and ultimately in terms of movement of goods and services. So it's absolutely critical we make those investments not just for moving goods and services, but also for people. So the second priority, I think, is accessibility for us. And I think you've seen Senator Duckworth really do some incredible things. We have something called the ASAP program that's making all our stations accessible. We don't have enough money to do it. And I think we're trying to model a program that could be good for any city and even in regional areas that have transit. So I'll put that out, accessibility, and I would like to include some thought about what is the buffer zone around a transit station in terms of accessibility. So how can we get ADA money, that's also ADA ramps, APS signals, those kinds of things as well. So like a whole kind of holistic package of accessibility that has a nice snowflake footprint in the city. The other piece that I have to shout out to, and I appreciate that there's work being done on water. Now I know that's not transit, but a big part of our infrastructure need is lead line service replacement. We have 400,000 lead lines in our city. Okay, that's more than any other country or city in the country. So these two things combined, right? Infrastructure is infrastructure. And so we're really glad to see both these kinds of things go forward in that holistic way.
Great, thank you. Peter?
Hoping you can hear me now. Thanks for having me. And yes, I remember going to Chicago and noting the periodic accessible stations, and the fact that we're still struggling to get accessibility. This is not a criticism because the financial challenges are very real, but we're more than a quarter century after the ADA, and we're still working to make it work for people. For our agency, in your introduction to my good friend and former colleague Therese, you mentioned that LA Metro has the largest expansion program. We argue with LA about that because we in Sound Transit actually are the largest transit-only expansion program. But it's just kind of fun to gig them about it. But the bottom line is we are really making up for some not very forward-looking votes that the people in this region took in 1968 and 1970 when the federal government was offering 90% shares to build out transit infrastructure. And we are now literally building many of the same projects that were on the maps that the voters rejected in 1968. But they've now, in 2008 and importantly in 2016, about 9 months after I arrived here, launched us into the largest transit expansion program in the country. Of course, it's a lot more expensive now. It's a lot more challenging now building into urbanized environments, and the federal government is putting up a lot less money in terms of partnership. So what are our priorities for reauthorization? Most importantly, to make sure that the dollars are there for continued and expanded partnership. And when I say continued, we were successful in getting 2 full funding grant agreements under the Trump administration, but we also got them, and one of the reasons we were successful there was because we offered up very low federal shares, 36% on one project and 25% on another. We are working on legislation that passed in HR 2 last year that would enable us and other projects, including one of Dorval Carter's projects, the CTA in Chicago, as well as projects in California and Minnesota, to increase the share of those projects, given what's happened with COVID revenues and the costs of those projects since those full funding grant agreements were reached. We also need to make sure that there's enough money. There is something that's emerged over the arc of history where a major transit expansion can only hope to expect, federal partnership in the range of 40 to 50%, when there are major highway expansions, which are still not all, but are still paying 80%. And we would like that redressed if we're really serious about climate change and trying to do something about it in the near term. And if the Biden administration is going to facilitate one of its campaign promises in trying to get high capacity transit deployed in a great many more communities than it is right now. So that I would say would be an important priority for us for any either infrastructure initiative or reauthorization. And you asked if we'd be bold enough to talk about something we don't want to have happen, and I'm kind of known for not being shy about that stuff. I really worry about some of the transformative policies getting watered down. I worked in the Senate for 22 years. Every major accomplishment that I could think of that I helped to work on in the Senate was done on a bipartisan basis, and transportation should be bipartisan. That said, I just worry about some of the more forward-leaning policies that were in the president's plan going the wayside because of the need to go forward in a bipartisan manner. So I just hope that both, the administration has some red lines that won't be crossed in terms of policy initiatives on that. One that wasn't necessarily a big push by the administration, but Kathy Dedrick happened to mention performance measures. I keep thinking about one of the provisions in the president's plan was to finally tackle 10 of the worst interstate bridges we have. And a friend of mine asked me, who's not necessarily versed in these things, how come those things haven't always been funded first? And it has everything to do with how we send dollars out to states and municipalities, and how we kind of peanut butter federal funding over a very broad base, and therefore, frankly, don't make great progress on anything. I mean, that's an overstatement. But in terms of, there's a question to be asked on when you've put out in the name of the federal government so many billions of dollars, and our core interstate bridges are still wanting. We have one that connects Oregon and Washington to the south here, well known as the Columbia River Crossing, that's still built on wooden piers that underneath some of the concrete. We're still trying to figure out, how the two states are going to be able to pay for that. Why that was allowed to languish for so long really speaks to a failure in the federal policies. And I hope things like performance measures and some of the forward-leaning policies, survive the congressional process.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I apologize. I'm having some connection issues here. We'll move on to Joe from Connecticut.
Again, thank you. And Peter, it's actually, it's refreshing, one, to see you and Therese and talk about Dohrmann and the times that, I used to have to come there, and, you were on the other side of this, and I was coming up there with, hands extended to go and look for ways to go and get things done. And I keep thinking over the fact that, when I first went down to Florida, and there were, 13 legacy commuter rail systems. There's now well over 30, and we all know how the transformation that's coming through and what we're all faced with right now. So in terms of, top priorities, and, ours has included the electrification of transit and rail, okay, that we're trying very hard to reduce greenhouse emissions, because Connecticut has now been called the tailpipe of the nation, because as all the winds move all the, greenhouse gases over, they hit the Atlantic currents and deposit down here, and we have tremendous asthma issues and other issues. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank Chicago. I've been in with your senators, gotten an awful lot of support, been in there with commuter rail coalitions as we're looking to go and see what are the best ways going forward. And love the fact, Peter, that you brought up some of the things on the bridges, because I was the superintendent here when the Mianus River Bridge failed on 95, and what we had to do to try and adapt a transportation system to be able to handle that. But it also led us to start looking at every one of the bridges. And, I'm in a state right now that isn't broken down by county. So I've got 169 towns. I've got, 14,000 miles of roads to maintain. And I'm trying to deal with the bridges and get them all, nowhere near in good, but at least get them out of the poor and into the fair and good condition going forward. So we have a lot to do on that end in terms of, both looking at it from the highway perspective, the rail perspective, and, at the end of the day, everybody is a pedestrian at one point or another. So how do we keep it safe as we're going through? So, it's interesting to go at it that way. And I also am going to join you in terms of the negative thing is that we can't afford to have politics as usual. It has to change. We have to start seeing that we end up, we've already talked about whether or not, we do the same thing on projects. Do we make them shovel ready? In which case we're only dealing with the ones that are currently sitting out there, as opposed to fixing what's really wrong with our infrastructure going forward. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge going forward. And I'm going to keep it short, because I want to get through and hit some of the other issues. And I haven't had a chance yet to, say to Therese, it was very interesting when Peter moved over that I had to start using you to go and pass the messages across. So good to see you again, Therese.
Thanks, Joe. All right, Therese?
Well, gosh, I mean, when you're batting last in the lineup, all your themes have been taken. So maybe I can just sort of repackage and reiterate a couple of things from the perspective of what, is our sort of top two priorities and issues we would want to see. And I'll start with more money. Yay, Gia, put that out there at the beginning. I mean, just that disinvestment in infrastructure generally is well known. I think, we just said before, this problem has been known for decades, right? And it sort of devolves into not being dealt with on the solutions end, but the problem is only getting worse, quite frankly. The second is more flexibility. Sort of thematically, more flexibility out of the federal program in three ways. More modal flexibility. I mean, we would like to see much more of an up in the STP, CMAQ types of formulaic things where we're recognizing in this country, it's so diverse, the needs themselves are different, the capacity to address them are different. The ability to leverage federal money is different, and providing more flexibility allows us, I think, to craft the solution sets that make sense in our areas. So modally, that's one thing, right? But also functionally, one of the things that is going to be a really interesting question, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of banking on the transit title, is this whole balance of operating versus capital. I mean, there had been such a bright line drawn as federal's not going to invest in operating until we had COVID and all the emergency things. And we realized that the federal capacity to help underwrite operating saved our proverbial bacon undeniably. So it's going to be it'll be really interesting to see what that means in terms of any differences in policies there, whether there should be a bit more flexibility allowed to make determinations of capital versus operating investments in certain circumstances. That's something that the current crisis we're all climbing out of, I think, raises an interesting question. The third area is flexibility in the partnerships, right? As speaking from an MPO bias, and thank you for the nod of saying we're the best, but that's a high bar to try to, have. But metro areas, urban areas have a different level of ability to partner and to deliver projects and to operate systems than other parts of the country. And I think the boxes that this much to state, this much to metros has been too rigid, I think, depending on the circumstances. I'm not sure that there isn't some improvements to be made in terms of who can step to the forefront in delivering different programs. And I think climate change and resilience is going to be a really interesting place to see that, because, what happens in Wyoming with massive wildfires going across is going to be very different than San Francisco dealing with sea level rise around the bay, right? So again, I think this focus on more flexibility in how we work with the federal government and with the programs will be really interesting. And again, if I was to say one thing I wouldn't want to see is an impasse in moving forward. Again, thank you, Gia. But the flip side of my things, too much rigidity in terms of how new programs in particular are set up. And that, I think, would be a real loss in particularly in areas like climate change, where there's a lot we don't know. So trying to be too rigid and prescriptive, thinking we know more than we do, would be a major problem. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Those are great comments. And I think some of the discussion about some of the longstanding kind of fights about or divides between capital versus operating. On the highway side, are we state of good repair or new capacity? And how much for control by the states versus the metropolitan areas? Things like that that we've fought over for years are so difficult in a zero-sum game, like we've had the last decade or so, without increases in transportation funding. So with the potential for an infrastructure package or a larger surface transportation bill, I think we would hope it creates new opportunities to break down some of those precedent type issues, the 80-20 split between highways and transit. What's in the federal interest? You talked about flexibility, which is normally kind of a state DOT mantra, right? But flexibility of local governments and metropolitan areas, the resistance has been, well, what's the purpose of investing federal gas tax dollars in that type of project? When in fact, a third of the Highway Trust Fund now comes out of the general fund. So maybe we can get past some of these kind of traditional divides and have more kind of a fresh look at what are the true needs and how do we provide resources to address those needs. The discussion about a stimulus, as we're coming out of the pandemic and massive amounts of funding, particularly for transit as a lifeline, and now we feel like we're moving to the recovery stage. And we use the word stimulus, but certainly I don't think people are talking about like the 2009 ARA stimulus package. And Joe mentioned, the shovel-ready theme, which maybe was well-intentioned, but really was led to the results that we should have expected it led to. So what are your agencies doing to prepare for potential funding, thinking about whether it's additional funding through current programs or new resiliency carbon reduction programs? How are you looking at your capital programs and thinking about how to be in a position and what types of projects you think you can move forward with? Because I think that's a lot of interest to this audience of, over the last year, we saw a lot of agencies put together project lists, I think oftentimes due to pressure from their board members, but that's not really the way that the legislation works in Congress. So now, as we move closer, what are you all doing to be in a position to act quickly, even if it's not in a world of unrealistic shovel-ready requirements like we had in 2009?
I could take a quick and opener to that, because I think the answer for us is rather simple. I mean, because we had this 2016 ballot measure that was a $54 billion package, we have a whole universe of voter-approved projects which we are scheduled to build between now and 2041. We are, because of challenges in increased costs and reduced revenues, now having to struggle to figure out how to reorder the projects to fit into a tighter envelope. So we've got a funding hole of about $7.9 billion. But the board is solidly behind delivering all the projects and delivering them as soon as we can. And one of the ways we do that is one thing we're not slowing down, obviously, is the environmental approval process to get these projects through environmental. That basically leaves us poised and ready, should there be a Biden package, to be able to get shovels in the ground faster. So we're literally laying out for all to see a series of necessary delays because of reduced revenues and increased costs, with a very explicit message to our congressional delegation and Washington, D.C. writ large, that with assistance, we can speed these up. And these projects really kind of check all of the boxes that the Biden administration has been talking about in terms, ours projects are the most climate-friendly projects in the state of Washington. We do everything through project labor agreements with strong support from unionized labor. There's an equity focus on a great many of these projects that we can get in the ground quickly in terms of communities that have been underserved. And we're going to get all those through environmental and be ready to go as soon as our local revenue sources rebound, and hopefully with some help of the federal government to get them deployed. But not everyone has a $54 billion voter approved program. So our future projects for the next 2 decades is set. Others are going to have to kind of pick and choose.
I want to jump on that a little bit, Peter, because from the standpoint that Connecticut has been very, very successful in terms of every year we use up all of our federal dollars, and we are able to take advantage of federal dollars that get left over from other areas because we have such a large inventory of need. I've got 4 major drawbridges that are on the corridor here that all have to be replaced. Some of them are from rising sea level going in and eating into them, and billions of dollars in need. I I got fixated when I heard what the agreement was for what your full funding grant agreement was, because, you know, a 37% and a 25%, you know, I remember when I was very upset down in Florida when, you know, you couldn't see an 80-20 anymore, and it was, you know, vying for 50-50, and we can't keep going in that direction. And that's why I think Therese hit it right when she talked about we need as much flexibility as possible going forward, because we have the needs, you know, and I even got balanced out. You know, I've got a high-speed rail system here, the Hartford line, that was ineligible for any CARES funding because it was designated a high-speed intercity. So I got no funding for that, but the Metro North was okay. And, you know, so, you know, it's a balance that you're going through all the time. So, and the answer is, I think all of us are in a position that we've got the projects. Now that the biggest issue is not all of us have the luxury that Peter has, that they've got that funding behind it. And I also want to point out that depends on where you are in the country. You know, I happen to come back to DOTs that are evenly divided between the highway side and the rail side, but I've also been with DOTs that have plenty of land and plenty of areas to build, and they're not as focused on what the investment should be. And I look at that from the standpoint of what we're doing to improve the air quality, what we're doing to improve the quality of life for all the citizens. But I'm going to shut off here because I know that I can see Therese and, you know, Gia are both ready to jump in.
Yeah. Let me just pick up a couple of threads here, because I was remembering on my first day at the job at FGA, and Peter, you probably don't remember, but you were talking very strongly, I will say, into the phone with someone over at OMB about, you know, the recovery, you know, the ARA at the time. And one of the things that was the most frustrating thing about that stimulus package was, back to my rigidity thing, the overwhelming obsession with translating everything into jobs creation. It was like this one metric that we had to sort of funnel everything through. And I just remember how some of the things that were ready to go, really valuable, would have a stimulative effect, particularly for transit. It was hard to kind of translate that into, you know, new jobs versus old jobs, sustaining jobs. It was totally crazy. I hope we avoid that this time. From this perspective, when we are, you know, talking about stimulating and coming back and recovery, in some cases, big projects will make a lot of sense. And I agree with Peter. If you are in an area that has a major capital program that maybe has a small amount to carry it over the finish line, right? That you can accelerate delivery because it's through. That is fantastic. In other areas, small, quick strike programs at a community level are what you are going to need to get local economies going. And particularly in our most vulnerable, you know, equity priority communities, as you know, we're defining them, that kind of investment is going to have a huge lift. That's very different than a mega project. And so I think we need to go in thinking about the people that are going to benefit at the end of all of this as our metric for what's the quote right thing to do. And it's a different perspective, and it's one that will be distinct for different areas of the country and in different perspectives. So I wanted to share that with you.
If I could follow on that, I think this notion of what is the right metric is absolutely critical. One of the things that we've done in Chicago is we had no idea if there was really going to be an infrastructure bill. So last summer, we actually did the hard work of working with city council, convincing folks of the need. And this fall, we've launched our own capital improvement program. It's really unusual moment we've not seen for decades, where we have about almost $4 billion in local money for our agency to spend it in 5 years. So we've been moving as fast as we can to sprint just to be in a state of readiness to carry that out. And so toward being ready in terms of the prior question about capacity, we've been doing the hiring, we've been doing the design work, the phase ones and all of that. So we're ready to go. But one of the things that we did that connects with this conversation about metrics is, as we're weighing out all of these programs, right? And in terms of the distribution across neighborhoods in what is a very segregated city in Chicago, and we have areas of disinvestment that have been left behind for decades, how do you really do that fine balance of getting to these equity areas? And so we actually developed new metrics around mobility hardship and economic hardship combined that gives us a geography that we include as weighted criteria in our programs. And so that makes sure that we're getting the distribution. I think this is the old challenge between like ridership and coverage, right? Like where you need coverage is not where you see the ridership, and you're not going to get your tickets, or your revenues fare box in the door. So from a capital investment perspective, we're putting our thumb on the scale and saying, okay, these are areas of the city that are faced by hardship in terms of access to transit, in terms of high and people with disabilities, in terms of high cost of transit, and then as well economic hardships that are really have been behind the generational poverty that we see in our city. So this is just to say that yes, we'll do all the job numbers you need. We'll make all the arguments we can, but to have that flexibility, I love that you brought that up, Teresa, because I think flexibility in how we measure, flexibility in how the programs are set up. We know how to spend the dollars, and we do it well. And if anybody's working on climate, working on equity, working on the kinds of things that are just right in front of your face, it's cities and state DOTs. We understand the implications of the choices we're making. And so my hope is that that thread of flexibility runs through just about everything, but again, not at the expense of not having action.
So it's kind of interesting, and I just want to, both of you talked about the jobs metric. I was recently flashing back because I was listening to the Barack Obama book, and he was talking about the challenge in getting the 3 or 4 Republican Senate votes we needed to get to 60 to actually pass the Recovery Act, and all of the concessions that had to be made. And I was working at the Appropriations Committee on the Recovery Act at the time before I was nominated to go to FTA, and that's why I was having so many of these flashbacks. There really was some great skepticism as to whether this whole stimulus was going to create jobs. And then again, they were also, now we're having this argument about what is infrastructure. Back then, the argument was what is really stimulative investment. And there were things like school construction in the Obama administration's original vision that had to was left on the cutting room floor because that didn't pass muster with where the stimulative investment should be, and whether that was a state and local responsibility in the views of many. But this investment that we're talking about now has to be different, if for no other reason. We don't have the kind of unemployment in the construction sector that we had back then. I mean, back then, I've had any number of workers on our projects who've come up and said, thank heaven for sound transit because back in 2008, 9, 10, we were the only people hiring folks off the bench. Well, right now, even during the pandemic recession, my contractors are flying in skilled labor from other states. We have a real workforce challenge and a real workforce opportunity. But I appreciate the president's drive on talking about how the American Jobs Plan will create jobs, but we really need a capacity to train people up to take those jobs, because I don't have a lot of people sitting on the sidelines right now. I've got contractors who periodically need to recalibrate and reschedule their work based on when they're going to get the skilled bodies in to do the work. That's very different from 2009.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I still, my memories from the Senate EPW Committee, and we would hold hearings with big posters of a Super Bowl stadium, because Senator Boxer's thing was there 20 Super Bowl stadiums full of unemployed construction workers, with the unemployment rate, I think, over 20% at the time. And we're just in a different day and age right now with labor shortages. Peter, I was happy to hear you talk about performance measures earlier, because some of those things we fought for in MAP 21 often get get overlooked. So, MAP 21 had a lot of policy changes like institutional performance measures and an asset management approach. You can simplify the FAST Act, how to focus on goods movement and trying to put some money towards mega projects. Now, I think the major themes discussed are resiliency and equity and carbon reduction. Do you all agree with those being the right focuses for investment? Do you think other things are being missed, or does anyone disagree and think that there are, at this point in time, with the opportunity to have a generational investment in infrastructure, that there are other areas and themes that are not getting its due attention?
Well, I think an important thing there, Andrew, and it's one of the, my understanding anyway of, what do they call the STRA bill, sort of almost star, is the fact that we're not switching out priorities, we're adding these to the mix. Right. So state of good repair is still there, as an example, and that type of thing. But and it kind of gets back to needing to make the basket much bigger in order to be able to bring additional investment to bear to focus on the additional things. Now, something like equity, to be quite frank, should be woven through everything we're doing regardless, even if we don't get a penny more. We need to be investing whatever current dollars we do more equitably straight up. And I think that's I'm a little passionate about this, but I think that is a responsibility that gets back to that why flexibility is so important. Gia, I was really interested in the metrics that you're using. I think we're beginning to realize that no matter how much we invest, we need to do it better by those who are most in need. Straight up. But other things like climate, we do need a lot more money to be able to catch up to the fact that we've neglected that area of investment for so long. Certainly, within federal policy, I would say, like in California, we've been on that bleeding edge of being ahead of the game. And one of the concerns, frankly, we have is because we're ahead of the curve, it's going to be really important that whatever is crafted as national climate investment policy doesn't leave us out, right? Because we might be farther ahead. But all that said, I think there's just, that's a different level that we do need additional investment. And I think it's a combination of making smart choices when we are, for example, in state of good repair, incorporating resilience-related design and other things into that element too. But then there's stuff like maybe we just need to build more levees, right, to protect, the highway that's, running next to, a body of water that's going to rise and flood it out. So it's an interesting, it's a very interesting challenge, and there's a lot of investment catch up in that space for sure.
I could jump in just real fast. I do think the priorities are the right ones, and I am not a climate scientist, but the urgency with which, change comes slow in infrastructure, and it's a period of time that science is telling us we don't have to actually pivot on greenhouse gas emissions. So that obviously has to be a priority. Totally agree with Therese that equity needs to infuse everything we do. And, I've said a number of times now, the pandemic was actually, I think, an important wake-up call or a reminder to our industry and transit as to why we're here, because you see in very stark relief which bus routes still had people riding during a pandemic versus who had the luxury of staying home. And it's actually triggering, a rich conversation around here in needing to, as we build back, there's no transit agency in this region that is saying, and we're working to get back the identical route structure that we had before. And we're actually we're known for our rail system, but we're actually the largest commuter bus operator still in the U.S. and a lot of those buses will be replaced by rail as we build it out. But we've got very stark differences in who was riding the bus, that, you know, both during the height of the pandemic and even now. And I've been kind of promoting this concept, as Therese knows, in the equity space. The tool that's been used for the longest time has been the required Title VI analysis. But you have to do a fair and equity analysis consistent with Title VI when you do a service change. If you don't change anything, you don't. And it raises a really important question, and that is, when was the last time you looked at your route structure and who you're serving from an equity perspective, and actually moved services around, which of course gets into local redistributional politics that are very tough. And we've had that around here recently with our partners at King County Metro. But I just think that, you know, we need to move beyond. You only need to look at equity ramifications of what you're doing when you're making a change, to a point of at least some kind of federal check-in about when was the last time you checked out who you're serving and how you're serving them now. And in some cases, you know, there are agencies out there that haven't really revisited its route structure in decades. And you can't tell me, as the way communities redevelop, that they don't need a fresh look.
You know, Peter, I'm gonna totally agree with you. Also, from the standpoint that it was a time for a reset. I can't remember in the entire time that I've been in an operating position that I ever had enough cars to go and deal, and I'm talking about rail cars right now, to deal with the infrastructure and the needs going into New York City or headed over to Boston. And suddenly I found myself with a situation that we could drop down the rails to at least 60%, if not more, okay, and get out a lot of the construction done that we never could find the time for, because you couldn't get it done. So we jumped on that opportunity, and we're so grateful that we still had funding available to go and do that. And the other end, when you know, I started it off by talking about the fact that, you know, we got behind the TCI initiative. We understand what the climate part is, but, you know, also as we were doing it, and you're exactly right, a line like our Waterbury line was critical for the people that were using it for going to the hospitals, for getting to the places of employment. So where you saw that, you know, there were people that could handle the work from home, and that changed a lot of the parameters. But the other end of it, the system that went down the least was the bus system. Rail system went down considerably, particularly for those going into New York or going into Boston. But the bus system did not. It stayed at, you know, around 60% when everything else dropped down to as low as 8%. So, you know, it was interesting to watch. And the other end is what we had to protect the most, was making sure that no matter what we did, we were actually adding buses on as we're going through and making changes to what our service delivery is going to be. So I think you hit on a very, very, very strong point for all of us, in terms of we're all looking right now at not how it comes back, but what's new in our world, okay? And how do we tie that in for both the equity issues and in terms of cleaning up the environment, as we're looking at more and more of the electric vehicles coming in. And I want to see our highways cleaned up as these. I'm now driving a plug-in hybrid, and I love the fact that, you know, we're seeing things move in that direction. And again, I see Gia's nodding, and I'm going to turn around and say, go ahead, Gia, I'm done.
No, I love that you're driving a plug-in EV. So no, I think I think this group has hit the nail on the head really on all these topics, right? I think, and what we're talking about is a way of thinking about these really big adaptive challenges like equity, like climate. You don't fix it in a day, right? It's not an engineering problem where I can just figure out the geometry and get it right, but we have to keep pushing, right? Equity, it's like a verb, and it's not a noun. We just keep moving toward it. So I think how we continue to kind of make inroads, but then make the adjustments as the technology catches up, right? As we're transitioning to these new systems, as we're catching up with California, it's sort of a continuity in that adaptation, I think, is also important in the way we think about delivering on these funding sources.
Andrew, you're muted.
Thank you, Therese. We're almost out of time, so I'll close with one quick lightning round, if anyone, again, is brave enough. Crystal ball time. Peter, you're not shy. You know how DC works or doesn't work. I'll put it. What do you think is going to happen on this year? If you're in Vegas right now, where would you put your chips?
Well, I think it'll be somewhere in the middle. I mean, you pointed out before the trust fund is still solvent, and I really hope that the momentum behind infrastructure results in something this year. Even if the solvency of the trust fund, which has been rightly pointed out, I mean, the whole trust fund structure has pretty much become a charade with all of the, what are we up to, like $170 billion in general fund bailouts? I mean, it's kind of amazing that people are still wanting to argue about transit versus highway share when the general fund is bearing so much of the cost. But the, as those of us who've worked up there know, Congress's record of getting stuff done before a deadline is not great. There was a time one year when we did 16 short-term extensions to get T21 done, I think, if memory holds. So I do hope, I am impressed by the amount of national media attention the issue is getting, which is a good thing, because that will require, it will make it harder for folks to just continue to kick it down the road without being called out for kicking it down the road. So, I do think there'll be, if you will, a kind of merge of the reauthorization of surface in combination with some of the president's infrastructure priorities from the American Jobs Plan, and I hope and expect it'll happen, this year. But I'm not optimistic about July 4th or something like that. I have to think that we're at least in the fall.
Anyone else have any ventures that they?
Optimistic fall.
All right, I like it.
Well,
People are going to keep talking a lot, so that's my prediction.
And I think, Peter, one of the things, when you turn around and we talk about the fact that, yes, we have to keep talking about it, because the other end of it is exactly what you end up seeing is everybody comes up with the solution, let's bond, okay? And we're going to just keep passing the debt on, and we're passing it beyond our children and our grandchildren now. And there has to be an accountability on it. And I think you're right that there is more attention being paid to the fact of whether or not we're coming up with solutions or we just keep kicking the can down the road. And I think that's the most optimistic that I can be on this, is that, having watched it and also reading Obama's book, okay, and seeing what he went through and saying, what the hell do we have to do now to get things through? Okay, so but I want to remain optimistic.
Same. Well, thank you again to the panelists, and I feel terrible that I'm invisible right now for my closing comments, but thanks to you all for a very interesting and insightful conversation. Thanks to the audience. Looks like we had a couple hundred people for most of it, so I hope folks around the country learned a little bit about your priorities and what it might mean and what infrastructure means to you all. So thanks again. And
thank you all. It's great to see you.
Thanks, everybody.
Very nice. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Have a great day.